I'd like to welcome all of you to the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County. We will be recording the platform address, including the Q&A, and posting it on Facebook, our website, and YouTube. For those of you who are unfamiliar with ethical culture, we are a humanist congregational movement about 150 years old, dedicated to exploring the ways in which we can live meaningful and ethical lives. Unlike a traditional religious group, there is no supernatural component to our services. But that said, there is no requirement of belief or non-belief in our movement. That's a matter between you and your conscience. Our motto is deed before creed. We believe that how you act in life is more important than any creed you might espouse. Our speaker this morning will be my dear friend, Dr. Massimo Pigliucci, who will speak on how to live a good life. Professor Pigliucci has a PhD in Evolutionary Biology from the University of Connecticut and a PhD in Philosophy from the University of Tennessee. He is currently the K.D. Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City College of London. His research interests include the philosophy of science, the relationship between science and philosophy, the nature of pseudoscience, and the practical philosophy of Stoicism. Professor Pigliucci has been elected Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science for fundamental studies of genotype by environmental interactions and for public defense of evolutionary biology. He is a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry and a contributing editor to Skeptical Inquirer. He blogs on practical philosophy at Patreon and Medium. At last count, Professor Pigliucci has published an outrageous 180 technical papers in science and philosophy. He is also the author or editor of 42 books, including the best-selling How to Be a Stoic, Using Ancient Philosophy to Live a Modern Life. Other titles include Nonsense on Stilts, How to Tell Science from Bunk, A Field Guide to a Happy Life, and How to Live a Good Life. At this time, I'd like to invite Ed Gross to make an announcement on from the membership committee.
Want to welcome all, and I see that there are quite a few new faces there, new to me anyway, and I want to especially welcome you and hope that you will come back if you enjoy this, as I'm sure you will. And if you'd like to learn more about us, of course, you can find out more online, or you can contact our office and have someone call you or email you with more information if you'd like a one-on-one to really get to know us more deeply. But I'd also like to encourage all, as long as we're on Zoom, remember that you can ask friends and family who are at distance to join us for a Sunday morning platform and learn about what you've been up to if you've been a member. So that's it from me. Thanks, Jamie. Back to you.
We will be doing music today, so I'd like to hand it over to Ron Schwartz to get us started.
Thanks, Jamie. Hi, everyone. Well, I think it can be said that we've had a really, really tough 4 years. We had a president that we had a loss of human dignity and compassion throughout our country. We had almost a loss of our democracy and the fight to keep it. We had an insurrection at our Capitol about a month ago. And we've had a pandemic where almost now 500,000 people have perished in our country, and we're trying to get through the worst winter of our discontent. So Lenny and I thought that this song, Mercy Now, would be appropriate for today, for all those who are struggling with what can only be described as PTSD from the last 4 years. Give yourselves a little mercy now. So this is Mercy Now, written by Mary Gauthier, coming to you from the Lenny Goldstein, Nothing But the Hits Sound Studio in Riverdale, New Jersey. Hope you enjoy it. Go, Lenny.
Yep, I'm going to do it right now.
Of his labor, all around
right slowly on the ground. His work's almost over. Won't be long, he won't be around. I love my father, but he could use some mercy now. My brother, he could use a little mercy now. He's a stranger to his freedom, shackled to his fears and his doubt. And the pain that he lives in is almost more than living will allow. You know, I love my brother, but he could use some mercy now. I love my brother, but he could use some mercy now. Ah, da, da, da. 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 Oh, my church and my country, they could use a little mercy now. They've fallen to a poison pit, gonna take forever to climb out. They carry the hopes of the faithful as we follow them down. You know, I love my church and my country, but they could use some mercy now. Yeah, I love my church and my country, they could use some mercy now. Ah, da, da, da. Ah, da, da, da. Ah, da, 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 da. Ah, da, da, da. Ah, da, da, da. And we all could use a little mercy now. You know, we may not deserve it, but we need it anyhow. We stand at the balance between hell and hallowed ground. And each and every one of us, we could use some mercy now. Yeah, we all, we could use some mercy now. Ah, da, da, da. Ah, da, da, da. Ah, da, 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 da. Ah, da, da, da. Ah, da, da, da. Some mercy now. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. I see now in my notes that this is the part where I'm supposed to read Massimo's bio. So I've already done that. And I won't do it again. But I would like to add, if you're interested, Massimo also does a philosophy book club with me. And our next one will be on February 28th. We'll be talking about grandstanding, the use and abuse of moral language. And you can find that on Meetup at his philosophy book club. And with that, I'd like to introduce my friend Massimo. Massimo, welcome. You have to
Hello. Hi. Nice to be here.
Hi. So we thought the best way to go about this morning would be a Q&A. So I'm going to ask Massimo some questions to get us started, and then I will open it up to anybody else who has questions. So I guess just raise your hands like you do for joys and concerns, and Lenny will call on you in whatever order he decides to do that. So to get us started, Massimo, tell us a little bit about the book, which I have here in case anybody is interested. How did this come together?
Well, the three editors, that is myself, Sky Cleary, and Dan Kaufman, are both colleagues and friends, were doing a podcast together. Dan was hosting one of his, I think it's called Blogging Heads TV videocast. And we're talking about the comparisons and similarities and differences between Stoicism, which is my preferred philosophy of life, and existentialism, which is Sky's preferred philosophy of life. And then at the end of the conversation, I think I was the one that said, it'd be nice to actually put together some kind of collection with a number, broader range of philosophy so that people can actually look at the incredible variety over cultures and times of ways in which people have figured out how to live a good life. And that led to eventually the book proposal and the publication of the book. The book has 15 contributions from a number of people that range from ancient Eastern, Western philosophies to modern philosophies to a number of religious approaches to life. Ethical culture is represented as well. And the idea was to offer this comparison, but with each chapter written by somebody who is not only an expert or a scholar in that particular subfield, but actually practices that particular approach to living a good life.
Excellent. So why Stoicism? What attracted to you that? Why not existentialism or Aristotelianism?
It was the result of as usual, as often in life, of sort of some determined searching on my part and some serendipity. So it turns out that a number of years ago, I was going through a mild midlife crisis, like lots of people do. In that particular case, it was a sudden change, fairly sudden change of career, personal circumstances, my father dying, everything in the same kind of few months. Nothing particularly unusual, but it's the kind of thing that makes you stop and say, I wonder how I should deal with this. And the thing is, I had no idea of how to deal with it because I grew up in Rome, in Italy, and so I was by default a Catholic until I left the church when I was about 15 or so. And after that, I consider myself a psycho-humanist. So when the crisis hit, I thought, oh, psycho-humanism, let me turn there and see what I can find that it's useful. And it turns out there wasn't much to be that was useful. And the reason for that is because although I agree with the principles of psycho-humanism, human rights and justice and all that sort of stuff, that really didn't do anything in terms of, yes, but how do I deal today with this particular problem, with this particular setback that life has thrown my way. So I decided, well, I was studying philosophy at a graduate level. This was the period that I was transitioning from biology to philosophy. So, well, you're studying philosophy, surely you can find something that is going to be helpful there. And so I kind of started a systematic search. I considered first Buddhism, which was interesting. It did really have a number of useful things to say from an ethical perspective and a practical perspective. However, the literature was written in a way that was obviously alien to me. I grew up in a different culture. The metaphysics was the kind of things that I really didn't click with me. So I said, okay, well, that's interesting, but not going to do it. Pretty soon I zoomed into virtue ethics. And virtue ethics is this ancient Greek Roman approach to things that focuses not on what is the right or wrong thing to do, but rather on how do you become a better person? How do you improve your character and your judgment? So I said, oh, okay, that sounds about right. the first stop usually in virtue ethics is Aristotle. So I started reading Aristotle. But it turns out Aristotle was a little bit on the aristocratic side of things. You know, he said that the good life is one in which, of course, you improve your character, you work on your virtue, but also you have to have a little bit of education, a little bit of money, you know, a little bit of good luck in general. You have to, you know, be good looking even, otherwise your life is kind of crappy. And I said, nah, that's just not going to do it. That's a little too selective for my taste. So I consider Epicureanism, because Epicureanism is big among psycho-humanists for a number of reasons. Epicurus had a lot of good things to say about, you know, the value of friendship, for instance. He was determined for people not to be afraid of death. He said, you know, death, the scary things that you hear about the afterlife, that were invented by priests that want to control you and scare the crap out of you. So all of that kind of resonated. And even his metaphysics was sort of science friendly, right? You know, atoms bumping in the void and that sort of stuff. However, the top priority of Epicureans is to live a life without pain, not only physical, but especially emotional. And one of the recommendations of Epicurus was, if you want to do that, just forget any social political involvement, because as we all know, they're painful. And I thought, no, that's not going to do it. I can't imagine a meaningful life without social and political involvement. So I was kind of there. And then that's when the serendipitous part came in, a tweet that said, help us celebrate Stoic Week. And I thought, what the hell is Stoic Week? And why would anybody want to celebrate the Stoics? And then I remember, wait a minute, Stoics, that's Marcus Aurelius. I read the Meditations when I was in college, and that's Seneca. I translated Seneca from Latin when I was in high school, but I never put them together. I never actually understood that they were actually talking about a systematic way of living your life. So I got curious, I signed up, and here we are.
So how does a Stoic live? Are there like practices or exercises? What do you do? How does Stoicism apply to real life?
Yeah, so I think stepping back for a second, we write in the introduction to the book that every philosophy of life or religion, and we consider religions a type of philosophy of life, is characterized by three components. There are exceptions, but three components. One is a metaphysics, that's an account of how the world works. Two is a ethics, that's an account of how you should live in the world. And then three is a set of practices. So let's say you're a Christian, your metaphysics includes things like there is a creator God outside of the universe that is all loving and all powerful and all knowing. The ethics, of course, involves the Ten Commandments, the teachings of Jesus, and things like that. And the practices include things like going to church regularly, listen to sermons, read scriptures, praying, you know, communing with other people, etc., etc. The same goes for pretty much most of, not all, the philosophies or religions that we consider, including Stoicism. So in the case of Stoicism, the metaphysical account is along the lines of the world is governed by a web of cause and effect. Everything happens because it's preceded by, you know, causes. So everything happens according to causality. That's essentially a way to say that the universe is a deterministic universe. Things don't happen with no reason or with no cause, no miracles, essentially. And the universe is made of stuff. Everything that has causal powers is made of matter, or matter and energy, or however you want to call it, you know, strings, gluons, it doesn't matter. It's made of something. Otherwise, it doesn't have, if something is not made of something, it doesn't have causal powers. So that's essentially the metaphysics. There's a lot more to be said, but that's the basic stuff. The ethics is about setting as your main goal in life to become a better person. And that means practicing, acting according to four cardinal virtues, which are practical wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. So you use these four virtues as your moral compass. Everything you do in your life, you're supposed to ask yourself, well, how does that fit with the four virtues? And the goal is to become, as I said, a better human being, to improve your judgment from an ethical perspective, to do your best in order to live a good, you know, positive life in society. In terms of practices, there's a lot of them, as it turns out. The ancient Stoics have a number of practices scattered throughout their writings, their surviving writings. And modern Stoics have kind of picked up on that and updated the whole thing in terms of, in the light of research from social and cognitive psychology. I have to mention that Stoicism was the original inspiration for cognitive behavioral therapy in the 1960s. The early version of CBT were directly inspired by the writings of Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and so on and so forth. And then they've been sort of, these techniques have been updated. So just to give you an example, a couple of examples, there are some techniques that I use on a regular basis. One is the philosophical journaling. This is the notion that ideally once a day before going to bed, but at least several times a week, you set aside a few minutes to sort of reflect on things that happened to you during the day that were ethically relevant. For instance, I don't know, maybe I got upset with a colleague or something like that. So you go over the episode and you ask yourself, what exactly happened? You reconstruct the sequence of events, and then you ask yourself, well, did I act correctly in that under those circumstances? And if not, how could I improve? How could I act better the next time around? It's supposed to be done in a detached, sort of non-emotional way. For instance, you tend to write these journal entries in the second person, so as if you were writing to a friend. So you did this, or you reacted this way, and there is evidence that shows that that helps. So analyzing the situation and not getting caught up again in the emotion of the situation, emotional part component of the situation. Other techniques involve mild exercises in self-deprivation. For instance, things like fasting or skipping. If you normally have a glass of wine with dinner, one night you skip, or 2 nights a week you skip it, or you go out in the cold without a coat and things like that. Now, why would you want to do that? Because there's 2 reasons. First of all, it's a reminder to yourself that you actually can do without some of these things. That you don't have to drink a glass of wine every night, let's say, or you don't have to, you can withstand the cold out there if it's actually something that you need to do. But more importantly, these are exercises in gratitude. They remind you of the kind of things that you take for granted. I just go out and grab the coat automatically without thinking about the fact that there are people in this city without a coat. I come back home and there is stuff to cook a nice meal, and I have to remind myself that that is actually not a given for everybody on the planet. So these are kind of exercises in both endurance, mild levels of endurance, but especially in gratitude. So there's a number of techniques like that. They are supposed to be helping you improve your judgment, pay more attention, be more mindful about what you're doing and why you're doing it.
And how has this carried over into our current pandemic times? Have you found Stoicism to still be helpful? Because it seems very few of us are living good lives these days. Most of us, they're pretty difficult, let's say. So has Stoicism been able to translate into these sort of bizarre times where we're isolated, we can't see friends, we can't do the things that we're used to doing? We're already going through so much deprivation.
Yep, that's right. So if you were an Aristotelian, you'd be screwed, because Aristotle would say, oh, too bad. There is all sorts of stuff that normally enters into human flourishing that you can't do. So too bad for you. The Stoics, on the other hand, I think are very helpful from that perspective, because Stoicism is particularly helpful with adversity, when adversity hits or when setbacks come up in life. Because it reminds you that, yes, all these things that you used to be able to do were nice and all that sort of stuff, but they really don't define who you are as a person. What defines who you are as a person is how you handle situations, no matter what these situations are. Epictetus has this nice analogy. He says you should learn to play ball like Socrates did. And what he means by that is, like, the ball itself that represents the circumstances where you find yourself in doesn't really matter that much. Yeah, it's sure it can be red or green or white. It can be bigger or smaller. It can be made of this material, that material. But what really matters is how skillfully you play with that ball. It's how you actually take the circumstances and do the best you can with them. Another analogy that I prefer, actually, a more modern analogy, is playing poker. So when you play poker, good poker players get ahead in the long run. And in fact, they make professional players make a living out of playing poker. And why is that? It's not because every hand is a good one, because they don't control the hand. Sometimes the hand is a good one, sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's a really bad one. But the skilled player knows how to take the most advantage of when the good hand comes in, and to limit the damage as much as possible when a bad hand comes in. And so, according to the Stoics, life is essentially like playing poker. You don't control the hand. It comes your way no matter what. It's fate or fortune or whatever, however you want, or the cause of what the causality of the universe. But what does matter is how you handle it. Now, one of the modern Stoic writers, Bill Irvine, just published last year, I think, a book called The Stoic Challenge, where he introduces people to a Stoic technique that is very well understood by modern psychology, which is and is referred to often as the framing effect. As you probably know, the framing effect is something that works like this. If you go to the doctor and the doctor says to you, so I look at your analysis and you get a 90% chance of surviving this, you react in a certain way. But if you come in and the doctor says, I looked at your analysis, you have a 10% chance of dying, you react very differently. And yet the facts are exactly the same. A 90% chance of surviving is exactly the same as a 10% chance of dying. But when it's presented to you one way, you're hopeful and you feel you can deal with it. When it's presented the other way, you're discouraged and you feel that you cannot deal with it. The Stoics were masters of the framing effect. They basically were looking at circumstances and they say, oh, somebody might call this a catastrophe. I'm going to call it a challenge. I am going to score myself on how I deal with this challenge, so that you focus on how to overcome things as opposed to, flagellating yourself on the back and say, poor me, poor me. Well, poor me, it's okay. But, what are you going to do? The thing is what it is. And your best bet to overcome it is to focus on what you can do, not on how unlikely you are because you got hit by this thing.
Thank you, Massimo. That reminds me of my favorite line from Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. And he says, why consider the bad thing a misfortune and not the ability to survive and prevail a great good fortune? So I thought that was worth bringing up.
Exactly.
So just out of curiosity, let's say Stoicism was not a thing. It wasn't an option to choose. Which of the other 15 or I guess 14 philosophies in this book did you find the most compelling, or would you be inclined to?
That's a good question. I think I would have to go with Buddhism, but throwing out much of the metaphysics. Because I can't wrap my mind around reincarnation and karma and all that sort of stuff. And by the way, that's actually something that I do for Stoicism as well. One of the things that I did not mention about ancient Stoicism is that the ancient Stoics believed that the universe is a living organism endowed with what they call the logos, the ability to act rationally. Well, I'm a modern scientist. I don't believe that the universe is a living organism endowed with the logos. So that part of the metaphysics also has to go. And that's fine. You can, there's plenty of Buddhist authors like Owen Flanagan, for instance, the contributor to our book for Buddhism, that, they do the same thing. They say, okay, well, these are ideas that started, 2.5 millennia ago or 2 millennia ago, and they do need update. It's not like you can take it. It's not like just because Buddha or Jesus or Chrysippus or whatever it is wrote or said this, then that it's going to stay. Of course, it's more difficult for religion, because if it's a religion, then you assume that that's the word of God, and it's a little bit more difficult to argue with the word of God. But Epictetus is not a god, and neither is Buddha. And so you could say, well, they had some great ideas, and they're still useful today. However, that part I'm going to throw out because it doesn't really work out for me. So Buddhism, I think, would be my favorite. It has the ethics. Buddhist ethics is actually very similar, not identical, but it's very similar to Stoic ethics. For Buddhists, the fundamental problem in life is suffering, and a major cause of suffering is what they see as the typically rapacious human ego. And so a lot of Buddhist techniques are aimed at reducing the rapacity of your ego, so that improves things for everybody in the world.
Excellent. I have one more question, and then I'd like to encourage anyone who's here to raise your hand or express an interest in asking a question. If you'd like to type it up and put it in the chat, I can also read it for you if you'd prefer that. But aside from your book, the Modern Field Guide on How to Be a Stoic, which has a workbook of daily practices and meditations you can do to be a better Stoic, if someone here today is interested in Stoicism, where would you recommend they start?
That is a good question. There is today there are a lot of resources, of good resources. There are a lot of good books out there to introduce you to Stoicism, both the ancient version and the modern version, which was not the case like 10 or 15 years ago. If you looked up 10 or 15 years ago, you would see mostly scholarly monographs that would not be particularly helpful in terms of practice. So I would say check out books by authors like Bill Irvine, John Sellers, or Don Robertson. Any of those is a good introduction to Stoic theory, and some of them deal with Stoic techniques. I would also, however, recommend reading the ancient authors, because this is part of the idea of embracing a philosophy of life or a religion is that you are connecting yourself to a tradition that it goes back centuries or sometimes millennia. And so it's a good thing to see what the early authors were writing. And there are some really excellent translations of the three big Stoics: Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca.
Thank you. Lenny, let me know, would you like me to call on people whose hands I can see raised, or would you like to take over this part?
I'll take over that. It's not a problem.
Okay, great.
Mark, your iPhone, you can mute yourself.
You're right. Okay. Thanks a lot. That was very interesting. I just have one sort of pointed question. So you were talking about, well, in Stoicism, from my reading of Stoicism, it says a lot of the idea has to do with fate and the ability to accept one's fate, and they're in the logos. But then you were suggesting that there's also this more materialist view of Stoicism. So I wanted to understand, and you say from your point of view, you don't subscribe or accept the logos concept in Stoicism. So I don't understand then. I think there seems to be an internal contradiction. How can a person act skillfully or make the right choices if they don't have free will? If it's a deterministic universe, if there's no logos, or if you can't identify with the logos somehow and to make decisions that are free, then how can you really improve your situation? So I don't see how one could throw out the logos and have a sense of identity with the logos, which would be some aspect of transcendence or radical freedom, as in a sort of an existentialist approach, or maybe even in a Buddhist approach, where there's also the sense of causality and karma, but there seems to be implicit in Buddhism the ability to sort of have awareness and to sort of transcend or to influence the karma. So I'm saying, what do you think about those issues in terms of
that's a great question. I have to clarify that the ancient Stoics themselves were determinists. The logos was matter, was a manifestation of matter and energy itself. So it's not like modern Stoicism is different from the ancient one in that sense. It is different only in the sense that most modern Stoics don't believe that the universe is a living organism, which just believe that it is what fundamental physics tells us it is, that is a set of dynamic processes regulated by things that we call the laws of nature. But the ancient Stoics were determinists, and we know this because they actually left some writings to that effect. One of the most influential and well-known is a bit by Chrysippus, who was the third head of the original Stoa. And he used this interesting analogy to explain how you can be a determinist and yet believe, not in free will, they didn't use the word free will, but believe in the human ability to use volition to arrive at judgments and to improve those judgments. Chrysippus says, so imagine a cylinder that you put on pavement, and then you push it. What happens to the cylinder? And the answer is, of course, the cylinder starts rolling. Then Chrysippus says, so why do you think the cylinder is rolling? And the obvious intuitive answer is, well, because I just pushed it. And Chrysippus says, well, that's part of the answer. Yes, you applied an external force to the cylinder. That is certainly contributing to the fact that the cylinder is moving, but it is also rolling because it is in the nature of cylinders to roll. If you were pushing a cube, there wouldn't be any rolling at all. It would either stay put or flip over, but it wouldn't roll. The analogy there is with the structure of the web of cause and effect that goes through us. And so some of those causes and effects are internal to human beings. They're part of our volition machinery, if you want. And therefore, we're not The image that often people have of determinism is that we're kind of puppets whose strings are moved by external events, but that is false. That doesn't work that way, because we're part and parcel of the web of cause and effect. And so some of that causality goes through us. And so my actions are mine to the extent that they are the result of my internal working on my internal machinery. In other words, ancient Stoics and modern ones are, from a philosophical perspective, compatibilists about free will. A compatibilist is somebody who says, yes, the universe is deterministic in the sense of regulated by cause and effect, but that doesn't mean that I am not contributing actively to some of that causality. And in that sense only, those are my actions. It's a long conversation, but that's pretty much the outline of it.
Okay, thank you. Elaine and Dan, unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. So obviously, first of all, thanks for a very informative discussion. There's obviously a lot to admire in the Stoic outlook as you've described it, and I'm a complete novice in this area, so I'm not going to claim to get it beyond what you've said. What concerns me is that while what I'm hearing sounds like it could be very applicable to an individual's practice, to preach this in the social and political realm can hearken awfully close for somebody who's relatively privileged, to put it out there, to a sort of a let them eat cake attitude, right? It could be interpreted as telling the poor or the oppressed, well, just learn how to deal with it rather than fight it. And so I was wondering, since I know you said your social and political commitments are present, how you would respond to that critique, or at least potential critique, of a Stoic approach when one is in the social and political arena. How does it not come across as telling the poor, suck it up and learn how to deal with it rather than oppose it?
Right. Yeah, that's another very good question, and that criticism is often raised. However, it's really hard for me now that I'm inside sort of the philosophy to see why even if it is raised. And the reason for that is there's multiple reasons for that. First of all, one of the four cardinal virtues is justice. So the Stoics right there constantly ask themselves, is this thing just or not? And if it's not, then they consider themselves duty bound to intervene, to try to be helpful. So that's one thing. The second thing is the Stoics were famously cosmopolitan. They considered themselves as citizens of the world, and they thought that the whole point of living a human life was to use reason in order to improve the human cosmopolis. Not just to improve your life, but to improve the human cosmopolis, everybody's life, right? So they were very much actually socially oriented. Epictetus taught his students to practice three disciplines in order to improve themselves. And one of these three disciplines is the discipline of action, which deals with how to deal with other people and how to be helpful to other people. If you read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, he constantly says, you're a social animal, you're supposed to help people. What are you doing? Ask yourself how to do it. So there is a lot of reasons to think that this kind of, let them eat their cake, it's definitely not the approach that the Stoics take in theory, but also in practice, because we have plenty of evidence from the ancient Stoics where they literally took arms sometimes to fight against what they perceived as an injustice. There is something referred to informally as the Stoic Opposition, which was a number of Roman senators and philosophers who were openly opposed to what they perceived as the tyranny of three emperors, Nero, Vespasian, and Domitian. Some of them lost their lives. Some of them were sent into exile. Epictetus himself was sent into exile as a result of opposing the emperor Domitian. So there is a lot of literature there, both in terms of the Stoic theory, the cosmopolitanism, the virtue of justice, and also of actual practice of people literally taking up arms if needed in order to improve the situation. So I'm very confident that a modern Stoic would agree that the major point of a Stoic life is actually to be helpful to others and to be improving everybody else's situation in life.
All right. Ken, you're next.
Hey, Massimo, thanks for joining us
Hey.
again at Bergen. It must be a relief to come visit us without having to go through a tunnel or step foot in the state of New Jersey.
Yeah, but then we are not going to have lunch afterwards. So, you
That's
know,
a disappointment. That is
Yeah.
a disappointment.
what are you
Yes.
going to do?
My question has to do with the practices involved, not specifically with Stoicism, but the fact that, first of all, you as a professor, having reviewed all the, or a number of these philosophies, and then also having put together a book that talks about the practices regarding these philosophies. But it feels, as you talk about your own practice, that it was really pretty much limited to Stoicism. So my question is, don't you feel a pull to bring things from other philosophies into your daily activities or daily practices, or do you see that you have actually done that? And if so, where have you pulled in practices from some of the other philosophies, and or dropped them out of Stoicism?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Well, for one thing, within Stoicism itself, there are some practices that don't work for me or they don't do much, so I just drop them. I don't, you don't do them.
Like what, for
I have.
example?
Was that?
Like what, for example? Can you give an example?
Like for instance, some of the exercises in self-deprivation, like taking a cold shower. Yeah, it's unpleasant, and I can do it. I've done it, but it doesn't seem to really do anything for me. It's just like, okay, so what? Now you've done this thing. Now, what is it? For other people, that might work. But more importantly, to your question, yes, there are several techniques, typically from Buddhism, that modern Stoics import. I have tried different kind of Buddhist meditations. For instance, my friend and co-author Greg Lopez regularly does Buddhist meditation as an integral part. So he integrates that with Stoic techniques. And I don't think that's a problem at all, because the techniques are really not the philosophy, right? There is a difference between the techniques and the philosophy. Think about Buddhism itself. Plenty of people meditate because there are well-known now benefits to meditation. It's to calm you down, it grounds you, it actually is helpful to deal with chronic pain, all sorts of stuff. But that, just because you meditate, that doesn't mean you're a Buddhist. You're a Buddhist if you buy and practice the philosophy, buy into and practice the philosophy. In fact, regardless of whether you meditate or not, Owen Flanagan in our book makes the point that actually rather few Buddhists meditate on a regular basis. So there is a decoupling there. Ideally, you want to do both. Of course, you want to look at and practice the precepts of a philosophy, but also put into practice the techniques. But the two don't have to go in a sort of a coherent fashion necessarily. You can import whatever works. Even some of the Stoic techniques that we do today are actually significantly modified from the ancient version, following research in modern psychology and cognitive behavioral science. For instance, the ancients did something called the Premeditation Malorum, which is fancy Latin for thinking about bad stuff happening to you. And so this is a situation where, for instance, Marcus Aurelius or Seneca say, you should, when you're approaching something that is difficult, you should reflect on the fact that it could go wrong, and prepare yourself mentally for how to deal with the fact that it could go wrong. Well, they used to do that meditation as a written meditation. They would use it as part of their philosophical diary. Modern Stoics tend to use it as a visualization type of meditation. And the reason for that, so you close your eyes and you imagine a scene as if you were looking at it from a camera. And the reason for that is because modern research says that that's a better way to do it. It's more effective that way than if you write it down. So there is no problem in my mind in mixing and matching different kinds of techniques, including importing them from outside or updating them from the inside. More problematic is what I've seen a number of people trying. Like, for instance, I'm reading an article just this weekend about somebody who's trying to put together different elements of Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Buddhism, and create a sort of what is sometimes referred to as an eclectic philosophy. You can do that, but you need to be very careful because these are philosophies that evolved over literally millennia, and so they have their own internal coherence. It's not that easy to just pick a concept or an idea from another philosophy and say, yeah, I'm going to do this one too. More likely than not, it's going to lead to some kind of internal incoherence or sometimes internal tension. That said, every philosophy of life starts out as a putting together of other things, including Stoicism. When Stoicism started out around the end of the 4th century BCE, the guy who established the philosophy, Zeno of Citium, actually had spent more than a decade, as a student of different philosophers belonging to different schools. And initially, what he did was to put together what he thought are the best ideas from one and the other. But eventually, then this kind of initially heterogeneous conglomerate was kind of polished, and some things were eliminated, other things were modified, so that you tend to have a philosophy that is, you want something that is internally coherent. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where all of a sudden you run into a dilemma that your philosophy has nothing to say about or says contradictory things about. But yes, modifications and updates, absolutely. And
But
importation.
you don't worry too much about the ethics board of the Stoic Society coming after you because you diluted it too much.
Correct.
Thank you.
All right, Javier, you're next. If you can unmute yourself.
I just very curious. The more that I read about ethics, are you guys, is that kind of philosophy? To me, it seems a little bit dry. It's a dry philosophy.
Oh, what do you mean by dry? I mean,
well, as a human being that I am, I'm very emotional as a human. I express my feelings. Yeah, sometimes I do negative, sometimes I do positive, but not be able to express your feelings, for me, that's something that is dry.
Right. Yes, but Stoicism is not about not expressing your feelings. That is, in fact, unfortunately, a common misunderstanding. The word Stoic with a little s, meaning the attitude in modern parlance of going through life with a stiff upper lip and suppressing emotions. That is not the same as Stoicism with a capital S, meaning the philosophy. The Stoics don't try to suppress emotions, for one thing, because it's not possible. Even the modern psychologists would tell you, just don't even think about suppressing your emotions, because it's a losing proposition. But even the ancient Stoics were very aware of that. Seneca writes several times that there's no sense. He wrote an entire book called On Anger, and he says, when you feel the first movement of anger boiling up inside you, don't even think about contrasting or suppressing it, because that's not going to happen. What you do need to do, however, according to Seneca, is to go out and take a walk. In other words, to disengage from whatever situation is making you angry. And the reason for that is because you don't want to act on the basis of your anger. And the reason for that is because anger tends to override reason. If you act on the basis of anger, you tend to do things that, even if your anger was justified, you tend to do things that you're probably going to regret. So the Stoics also made a very interesting distinction between essentially 3 types of emotions. The ones you cannot control at all. Like, for instance, if somebody says something embarrassing, I may blush. And there is nothing I can do about it. It's like, that's it. That's the way I react. And there is no controlling, there is no dealing with it. It just happens. And then there are 2 types of emotions that you can negotiate. One are what they refer to as unhealthy emotions, and one are what they refer to as healthy emotions. Unhealthy emotions are defined as those emotions that override your ability to reason. And so they make you do things that you're likely going to regret. Those include anger, fear, hatred, all that kind of stuff. But then there are the healthy emotions. Those are emotions that are in agreement with reason, as the Stoics would say. In other words, those are actually good emotions to have. And you want not only to have them, but you want to actually mindfully cultivate them. And those emotions include love, include friendship, include a sense of justice, which is considered an emotion in Stoicism, include joy for the right kinds of things, love for the right kind of people, for the right kind of ideas, and so on and so forth. So the situation, the relationship between Stoicism and emotions is a little bit more complex than the stereotype of the stiff upper lip. There are some things that we want to cultivate because they're actually good for us, some emotions that are actually good for us. And then there are others that we want to negotiate and certainly not act on their basis because they're not good for us.
Thank you. Pam, you're next. You can unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. Thank you for that great program that you offered today. But my question is a little different from everybody else. You used the word free will.
Yeah.
Free will is something that adults have, the ability to make things happen. But what happens with children? We introduce religion into our children's lives, and we expect them to learn from the religion what we have the understanding. Children don't have that understanding. So my question is, can children be Stoic? Can children learn the things that adults learn after being already indoctrinated into some kind of religion?
Yeah, that's a great question. Part of the answer is, as we're speaking, I'm actually working on a book with two collaborators of Stoicism for kids. So the answer would be yes. However, it needs to be qualified. The Stoics themselves had an interesting theory of developmental, what we would today call developmental moral psychology. They thought that what they call a virtuous behavior, which in modern parlance would be a pro-social behavior, is kind of instinctive for human beings. We are born with two things immediately, two instincts immediately. One for self-preservation, right? Even if you're a toddler, you tend to act in a self-preserving way. And two, of pro-sociality. That is, we immediately seem to develop bonds with the people that are near us, right? Typically our caretakers, right? Our parents or grandparents and so on, siblings and so on and so forth. Then when we start, the more time passes, the more these instincts sort of enlarge their area of application to things like, friends, to people that we acquaintances we're knowing, etc. And then, according to the Stoics, what happens is that we hit what they call the age of reason. That in developmental psychology is the moment where it's the age where children begin to be capable of sophisticated abstract thinking. And they are much more clear about the distinction between themselves and other people. They realize that other people are actually very different and they have their own agendas, et cetera, et cetera. That age is between 7, 8-year-olds or thereabouts. For the Stoics, that is the point where you can start training your children. Explicitly. Of course, you have to do it at the right level, in the right way, using the right language, the right examples, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the moment you start training your children, and then the training just continues into adulthood. And in fact, for the Stoics, basically our entire life is a matter of training to become better. But it really starts explicitly with the age of reason. This is not just the Stoics who thought so. The Jesuits famously said, give me a child of 7 and I'll give you a man of 14, right? Meaning that is a crucial age, that's a crucial period during which you can actually shape the character of an individual. And so yes, absolutely, Stoicism can and should, I would argue, be taught to children, not just Stoicism, any positive philosophy of life ought to be taught to children, because it's a mistake to address only to adults, because adults are already fairly well formed, and it takes a lot more energy and effort to change the point of view or the position of an adult than it does in the case of a kid.
Very good. Diane Krasarski. You can lower your hand. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you. This is a fantastic coagulation of ideas that I've had floating around for a long time. Is there any point in having a community of Stoic perception, or is it pretty much for the lone practitioner?
No, that's a good question. No, there's very much is a point in having a community. And in fact, modern Stoics have been working on creating these communities. There is a website that you can go to called the Stoic Fellowship, where you can actually register online in your location, and they will put you in contact with other people that practice in Stoicism in the area. The goal is to create local stoas throughout the world, and right now there are several hundreds already throughout the globe. That is something also that the ancient Stoics did. One of the differences between ancient Stoicism and most of the other ancient philosophies in Greece and Rome is that the Stoics were expressly and explicitly in the middle of everything. For instance, if you wanted to study with Plato, at the academy, you had to get outside of Athens, and you could get there only if you have a horse. If you wanted to join the Epicureans and be a member of the garden, then you would also have to go outside of Athens, and be admitted into the little community. They're kind of exclusive communities. The same goes for Aristotle's Lyceum. The Stoics, on the other hand, were teaching in the middle of the market, where everybody could approach, everybody could ask questions. In fact, the very word Stoicism comes from the Stoa Poikile. The Stoa Poikile is translates as painted porch. It was a columnate right next to the agora, right next to the market, where it was open. People would just go in, ask questions, join the discussion, etc. So Stoicism has always been open to people from the beginning. And yes, there are communities as we speak throughout the world of practitioners, people that help each other, people that give advice to each other on how to practice.
Thank you.
All right. Terry, you're next.
Hi. Thanks. Great talk. So the book contains a chapter on ethical culture, meaning you consider ethical culture a philosophy of life. And you mentioned that you rejected secular humanism, I think, early in your talk. But as an ethical culturist, I'm interested why, when Jamie asked your second philosophy of life, what the choice would be, you said humanism. So if you could, we can take it. We're tough. Tell us what you find about ethical culture to be lacking or not satisfying to you.
No, I don't find anything lacking in ethical culture, but I answer Buddhism, not humanism. So
yeah, I meant
right.
that early in your talk you had said that you had mentioned secular humanism, I believe, as something that prior to Aristotelianism. So I was wondering if I consider ethical culture religious humanism, right? Because it's our religion. Right. But anyway, so
it's very simple. When I was going through this process, I knew nothing about ethical culture. I was very familiar with secular humanism, which, by the way, I don't reject. I still think of myself as a secular humanist. I just don't find it very useful in terms of actual setbacks that I have to deal with, when I have to deal with things in life. It doesn't have a set of exercises. It doesn't have a set of practices or anything like that. But I still consider myself very much a secular humanist, and therefore also a keen in spirit to ethical culture. It's just that when I was going through that process, I knew very little about ethical culture. I knew much more about secular humanism. Sometimes it's just what you know and what you don't know.
Okay, Deborah, you're next.
Hi. Okay, so I have not read the book, but I've heard a lot of people sing your praises. So I decided to come, and I wanted to thank you, by the way, for making this accessible, I guess, because I feel like people a lot of times use big words and refer to other concepts, and I felt like I could understand some of it. But I liked Pamela's question where she talked about children, because I was thinking about the difference having, I guess, free will or autonomy and having that recognized maybe by outside forces. So like, what if you're in a situation, like you're in a country or a region or a certain community where you should, I would think, have autonomy. I think everyone does, but that's constrained, let's say, or limited in some capacity. Like, do you feel like that would be something that would be like adapted for different cultures or different places, or like the Stoic philosophy? Or do you think, I know you mentioned the difference between techniques and the like concepts themselves. Do you think that that would be applied differently, or they're like definitely universal concepts depending on whatever culture, like region you're in?
That is a good question. My sense is that the Stoics at least mean their philosophy to be universal. What they would say is, if you're a human being, you can practice Stoicism because you're capable of reason and you have pro-social instincts. You live in a society, and so there is a way that those are the only requirements in order to practice Stoicism. Now, you're absolutely right. You may, growing up in a society that's much more constrained in terms of personal freedom and so on and so forth than in others, but that was true also in antiquity, right? And in fact, it was also true for different Stoics in antiquity. For instance, one of the most famous Stoics is Marcus Aurelius. He was an emperor, so presumably he had very little constraint in what he wanted to do, right? He was literally the most powerful man in the entire Mediterranean area, so he could do almost whatever he wanted to, right? But one of the ancient Stoics was also Epictetus. Epictetus grew up as a slave. So that's the bottom of the rung in terms of social ladder in terms of ancient Greece and Rome, and yet he was able to learn and practice Stoicism, and then eventually, when he was freed, he became a teacher. So the Stoics would say, no matter what the constraints are on you, you can still strive to be a good person, to handle whatever situation the universe threw your way in the best way possible, and especially in a way that it's mindful of other human beings, that it's mindful of treating others with respect, with dignity, as they deserve, because they're human beings. That said, of course, as I said, yes, the range of what you can do obviously varies dramatically from time to time, or culture to culture, historical moment to historical moment. But that's, in a sense, part of the core of Stoicism, that the Stoics will tell you that the circumstances are what you play with. And what is important is how you play with those circumstances. If you don't control the circumstances, if you grow up in an environment where you're in North Korea and under a dictatorship, then obviously you're not going to be able to control the circumstances. There's very little you can do in terms of the big picture. But that isn't going to necessarily stop you from being a decent human being, from being helpful to other people, from conducting yourself with what they would call virtue and that sort of stuff. So I think it is certainly meant as a universal philosophy, just like, to be fair, a lot of other philosophies or religions. Like Buddhism is meant to be universal. It's not like in fact, it's interesting that Buddhism originated in India, but it's now much more popular in China. In India is a minority. It's a minority religion. It is much more popular in China. So right there, that tells you that, and those are very different societies. So right there, that tells you that the principles and the practices can actually be followed by anybody, regardless of circumstances. And then it's just an accident of history where they become particularly popular. Another little, perhaps, piece of evidence I can give you about the universality of Stoicism is simply the fact that one of my first book on Stoicism, How to Be a Stoic, has been translated now in like 15 different languages, including Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and so on and so forth. So that means that there are people out there, enough people out there that are interested in this kind of philosophy, even though this philosophy came out of a Greek and Roman tradition in the Western world. Just like we in the West are interested in Confucianism or Taoism or Buddhism coming from the East.
Thank you.
Okay. Lisa, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I'm going to show myself.
All right.
I'm so happy to be here. So I've visited the Ethical Culture Society maybe like one time or twice, like maybe in the past 3 years. And I just saw the title today. So this morning, like early in the morning, when I saw the subject, I called right away. I emailed like, please, I was like waiting, like a kid in a candy store. So I really appreciate what you're talking about, Stoic. I've never heard of this before, right? But I'm taking notes. But I grew up with a Christian background, right? So I try to relate it to like my beliefs, right? So to me, it means like, what are your morals? Like you said, the age of like 7 and 13 or 14, like 13 or 14 is the age of accountability, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
I know like, in the Jewish culture, they give bar mitzvahs, right? But you said 7. I know between the age of 1 to 7, it's like where character is like, pretty much where it's developed, right? So I think 7, about 14, you should be able to now take what you learn, because now you can build on that. And that's what takes you into adulthood. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no, definitely. And as I said, according to not only the Stoics, but in fact, modern developmental psychologists, our moral development is a process. It starts out literally from when we're born, because we are endowed biologically endowed with certain instincts that include being, pro-social, being able to form bonds with other people. But once we start reasoning about things, we're capable of actually thinking about stuff and, stop and say, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? Then we are capable of greatly expanding that sort of, instinct, and make it become pro-social, not just about the people that surround us, but anybody on earth. The Stoics had this, one of the 2nd century Stoics, Heracles, had this really interesting image. He said, imagine yourself, start with yourself, because you are you are the one that is thinking about this stuff. And then imagine that there is a circle around you that includes your family and friends. And then there is another circle that includes your fellow citizens, within your city. And then there is your fellow countrymen within your nation. And then finally, there is everybody on earth. And Heracles says, your goal is to take these circles and bring them closer and closer to you. Right? So you want to treat your friends as if they were family. You want to treat strangers as if they were your friends, and so on and so forth. Right? So that is one of the major things that I find appealing about Stoicism, that there is this notion of expanding to everybody, expanding your concerns to everybody, regardless of where they are, regardless of who they are.
Thank you so much. And I'd like just to conclude with this. The young lady who spoke just before me, I really resonated with what she said. She had asked a question like, so what if, you have, like, you come from a different culture, or you have some, I would say, like, I'm a proponent of coming from a hard life, but at the same time, it doesn't take away, like, character. And, you have to be, like, I say, you have to, like, be your own God. Like, God lives within you, whatever that is. Sure. It's almost like you have to self-govern yourself. And then once you can see who you are, then it pretty much expands. And like you said, it starts with just the self, then family, then it should all come back to you, And that, it's like almost like shaping a heart. It should all come back to, like, what are you doing? If all the things that happen, like, you should, like, ebbs and flows in life, within yourself, you should govern yourself and pretty much be the judge, the jury. You should know, like, have certain things within, stoic, be stoic.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect word. I know it sounds like, it's a lot,
it is a lot. That's right.
Just to articulate it, so thank you that, I have to, like,
absolutely
professionals online, so I'm taking my notes. I have my book, so, it's all making sense now. It's all coming home, it's all, like, connecting. The dots are connected for me, So thank you so much, because I think that, it's not like we all inclusive, right? We all have something to add to it, not one man have it, but, right. I think, the universe is that's the beauty of it. We all have it. So let's bring it together and respect it, right? So this is a safe space. And I thank you for the safe and brave space that everyone just allowed me to have today, because I'm an introvert. I don't really speak this much, but this is, like, a topic that I so love. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Allison Goldstein, please unmute yourself.
Lenny, can you hear me?
Unmuted. You're good.
Okay. Two unrelated things. One, to Lisa, you did great for an introvert. I think we all enjoyed listening to you, and I hope you come back again. My question is, how do you practice Stoicism or good ethical behavior when you're in the heart of capitalism?
Good question. Well, one of the reasons I actually find Stoicism interesting is precisely because it's really not friendly to a consumerist society. The Stoics think that there is nothing wrong. So they refer to a certain kind of goods as externals. So externals include things like money, health, wealth, reputation, and things like that. All those are externals, as opposed to your character, which is internal. Okay. And the Stoics think that pretty much the only thing that you can deal with, that it's really up to you, it's your judgments, it's what you do, what you decide to do. The outcomes of what you do is not necessarily up to you, right? You can make for instance, the best decisions in terms, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so you can make the best decisions in terms of your health, wear a mask, double your mask, social distancing, get the vaccine and all that sort of stuff. And yet you might still end up sick because viruses are, sneaky things. So the notion is you should focus on what's up to you, the decisions, the judgments, and then accept, basically, prepare yourself to accept with equanimity the outcomes, because sometimes you control them and sometimes you don't control them. In terms of a consumerist society, the issue is the Stoics think that all of these other stuff, money, fame and career and all that sort of stuff, is what they call a preferred indifferent, which sounds like an oxymoron, right? Because if something is preferred, how can it be indifferent? Well, it's preferred meaning that other things being equal, it's okay to make money or to have things in your house or to have a good career, whatever it is. It's fine, so long as that doesn't get in the way of your moral improvement, of your character. If it undermines your character, then it's not a preferred indifferent. Then it becomes something that you actually shouldn't do it. So, particularly in terms of things, all of the ancient Stoics say, get rid of as much as possible, because the more things you have, the more you are distracted in life by pursuits that are really not that important. If your major goal in life is to become rich so that you're going to have a lot of stuff, then according to the Stoics, you are actually misliving your life. You're really not paying attention to what really matters. And by the way, there is research evidence from modern research that they were pretty much correct. Psychologists have done research on people on their deathbed, and they asked them, so what sort of things do you regret and what sort of things you don't regret, right? And I can guarantee you, very few people regretted not having a second car or a second house or a better iPhone or any of these things. Or in fact, even very few people regretted not having spent more time at the office or not having made more money. What they did regret was two categories of things: not having had better relationships with their loved ones, friends, family, and so on and so forth, and not having done things that were meaningful to them. And typically meaningful, something to be meaningful includes the notion that it is useful for other people. Okay. So the Stoics were correct, I think, that the important things in life are relationships and meaning. The rest, sure, if you can have, if you have a smartphone, fine. It's no problem. But if you become obsessed with the smartphone, if you think that this is really an exciting thing, that you really have to have absolutely the latest model as soon as it comes out, because otherwise you die, then you're misguided. Then there is a problem.
Question, Linda Bennett, please unmute yourself.
Oh, good to hear you again, Massimo. I
always
enjoy your talks.
Thank you.
In the current situation, I find myself feeling that reason has become hollow, that I can't trust it anymore, because we have such a schism in this society, and it's not new. It's happened before. This is a repeated kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And such a flight from reason, an absolute ingrained inability or unwillingness to use reason, that I almost feel betrayed by the idea that human beings, and us particularly, who espouse the value of reason, that it's proven to be a false support.
Well, I hear you, but then the question is, what's the alternative? To be more unreasonable, and join the unreason? That seems like a bad idea. Look, I understand what you're saying. It is dispiriting.
Use it to reach other people, and that's what psychology is telling us now. Is you can't use it to reach other people. You can't apply reason or persuasion because it's not working.
Well, yes, there is some research in psychology that over the last few years that suggests that people are much less amenable to changing their mind and, to respond to reason than we think. But even there, I actually looked at those studies. One needs to be careful because those conclusions shouldn't be generalized too much. People still do change their mind. I mean, we have plenty of empirical evidence of the fact that people change their mind. People are still responsive to reason. What we're experimenting in this society over the last several years is actually the result of a large number of factors, including the systematic undermining of public education, for instance, the systematic undermining of public discourse by certain forces that are hell-bent into undermining the effectiveness of reason. So I don't think that it's a good idea to blame reason itself. We should blame the people that have undermined trust in reason and the practice of reason. But also we need to keep in mind that still today, too many people seem to have this dichotomy between reason and emotions, right? They say, "Oh well, I'm not a reason. I don't go much for reason. I'm very emotional." That's from both a Stoic perspective, but also from a modern cognitive science perspective, is nonsense, because it's not like your brain has separate components that don't talk to each other. One is reason and the other one is emotion. Reason and emotions are deeply interconnected. There's no way that a functional human being, unless you're a psychopath, for a functional human being to actually disentangle reason and emotion, which is why the ancient Stoics thought that you can talk to your emotions. You can engage with your own emotional discourse in order to come up with better and better outcomes. So when it comes out to persuading other people, I have to say the best answer that I come across is still Aristotle, who was not a Stoic, but he wrote a bunch of interesting things. He wrote an interesting book on rhetoric, where he says, if your goal is to persuade other people, you have to use three things. Logos, which means reason, right? So you have to have good arguments. Ethos, which means reputation. You have to make sure that people trust you, that people know who you are and they have a trust in you, because if they don't trust you, they're not going to listen to reason, regardless how good the reasons are. And pathos, which means emotional connection. You need to connect with the people emotionally. They need to understand that what you're saying matters to them, that you have their own well-being at heart. And I think that too much discourse today emphasizes logos, it emphasizes formal reason, and it does not, and it de-emphasizes or even try to get away as much as possible from both the pathos and the ethos. I blame even scientists and science communicators. Scientists are actually trained not to engage in emotional discourse because they think that somehow that would undermine their objectivity and things like that. But we are human beings. We need all three components. Aristotle was right. If you do not engage all three components, you're simply not going to be able to reach across the aisle. And the second notion that we mentioned already before is that it's very difficult to have adult human beings who have invested a lot emotionally in their lives in a particular idea to change their mind. What you need to do is to reach the next generation more than the current one. Sure, some people change their mind even in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on and so forth. But really, what you want is to target the next generation. You want the next generation to grow up with new ideas. This works in public discourse just as it works in science. The joke in science is that science doesn't make progress because people change their mind. It makes progress one funeral at a time, because the old scientists die and the new generation comes up who is familiar with the new ideas and therefore more open to the new ideas.
I have a question. So do you see a difference, or in what ways do you see a difference between Stoicism and pragmatism?
Well, there are a number of differences. For one, pragmatism doesn't really seem to have much of a metaphysical background. By nature of its philosophy, they tend to avoid anything to do with metaphysics. So they don't have that component. They also don't seem to me, at least to my knowledge, they don't have the third component of exercises, of practical practices. So they had the ethical component, the second bit. And to me, those are, they make a difference, meaning that the ancient Stoics argued that in order to live a good life, you also have to have a sort of a general idea of how the world works and how to reason correctly about that. And so they thought that, for instance, scientific knowledge is a virtue, and sound reasoning is a virtue as well. And so all those components have to kind of come together into one system. I find that particularly satisfying from that perspective.
It was interesting when you talked about the metaphysical aspects of it. I guess, if you're a materialist / atheist, or even a deist, because you sort of look for things that don't have a strong metaphysical, that don't have strong supernatural requirements,
right?
Which often blends into the metaphysical,
right?
That's
true, but metaphysics, of course, is not synonymous with supernatural. Yes, there certainly is a supernatural metaphysics. But broadly speaking, metaphysics is simply an account of how things hang together in the world, right? So I tend to be pay attention to what is sometimes referred to as scientific metaphysics these days, which is essentially metaphysics that is strongly influenced and informed by science, because if you want to know how the world works, then typically you turn to the scientist. The reason why you can't just do science and you need to be a little bit more general than that is because the individual sciences don't give you the full picture. Scientists tend to be very specialized, and so you get a picture from biology, you get a picture from chemistry, you get a picture from physics, etc. Metaphysics is kind of in the business of giving the overall, how the whole thing kind of hangs together.
Massimo, thank you so much. I'd also like to thank Lenny for being such an excellent Zoom master, Ron for the music, Sam for introducing us to Sunday school. If you would like more information about ethical culture, stick around for a few minutes. I'm not sure if they're doing the break rooms today, but there may be some break rooms where you can meet with committee members to ask some more questions. 2 more notes, and then we're going to call it a day. If anybody is interested in how to live a good life or some interviews with some of the other contributors, you can find that over on Massimo's YouTube channel. And lastly, on behalf of the Finance Committee, you have an opportunity to donate virtually by going to ethicalfocus.org/donate. And I'll ask the Zoom master to put that into the chat window. And with that, I leave you. Thank you so much for joining today.